Thank you. I'm really happy to be here with you this evening. And before I get started, I should mention that I brought some brochures, some booklets that we presented, that we published not too long ago about our collection. But I didn't bring enough. And my husband is glad I didn't bring any more because my suitcase would have been even heavier. So what I'll do is I will send another batch to Fran here at the Korea Society when I get probably the week after Thanksgiving. So if you didn't get one and you'd like to have one, you can be in touch with Fran and she'll make sure that you get one. So you probably think that when you hear that when I'm from the University of Minnesota, that I should be talking about Nordic sweaters instead of traditional Korean furniture. And you'd be right, because it's probably one of the last places where you'd expect to find one of the best collections of traditional Korean furniture. But yet, the Edward Reynolds Wright collection is just that. Now I've got to get coordinated here. Here we go. There. I'm going to talk a little bit about the collection and how it came to us, and just a tiny bit about our museum. We are a part of the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis, which is the capital of Minnesota, right on the banks of the Mississippi River. And this is the Frederick R. Weisman Art Museum, seen from across the Mississippi River. We're really an iconic landmark in the Twin Cities in the state of Minnesota, and certainly for the university. We are the first art museum that Frank Gehry designed, who later designed the Guggenheim at Bilbao and the Disney Concert Hall. But we were really a turning point in his career because we commissioned him before, he was building our museum when the Guggenheim hired him. And so I think we really were a turning point in his career as an architect. You can see the iconic nature of the building. We love the identity that it gives us and what we think it says, which is that this building is about art. And students, it's right in the middle of your lives, whether you like it or not. And you don't have to like it, just as you don't have to like all art, but it makes you think about it. And we think, just even if it does that, even the architecture itself is helping us do our mission as an art museum at a university. Our collections database shows that we have 616 objects that list their origin as Korean. Of those, 218 are listed as furniture, and 514 are indicated as a gift from the Edward Reynolds Wright collection. So much of his collection was furniture, but it also includes other kinds of objects, household objects, some screens, some weaving equipment, other kinds of more anthropological objects. Thanks to a grant from the Korea Foundation, the museum established a small gallery for the long-term display of a few pieces from this collection when we reopened after an expansion and renovation in 2011. Our original Frank Gehry Museum opened actually 20 years ago this week. And then in 2011, we opened an expansion. And it was at that point that we carved out a space so that we could always have a place to show our Korean furniture. In March of 2013, this last March, we had a visit of scholars and experts from the Overseas Korean Heritage Foundation, and they confirmed that indeed our collection is one of the most complete and prominent anywhere. I'd been saying for years, just from my research, that we had the most complete and the best collection of Korean furniture outside of Asia. But when the experts from Seoul came, they said that it really, really was of world renown. So made me feel very, very good and quite vindicated in what I'd been saying. So these are the scholars who came from Seoul, and it was really wonderful to have them come. They're documenting our collection. They came to document our collection. They looked only at the furniture. They spent a very intense week. They're going to come back next year. I'm sorry, they didn't come in March. They came in August, and they're coming back in March to document all the rest of the collection, the screens and the paintings and the scrolls and that sort of thing. But on this trip, they just looked at the furniture in the collection. Dr. Kim was the real expert on Korean furniture, And they inspected every piece very, very carefully, inside and out. They took lots of pictures. And what was most wonderful about their visit was that they came with the intention of documenting this collection, but not with the intention of trying to bring it all back to Korea. They're very pleased, actually, that it's where it is, because it spreads a love and an appreciation of Korean arts and culture in this country. And so we were very happy to have all the information, the additional information that they were able to give us about the collection. They do plan to do a publication of our collection. The last Korean collection in the United States that they published was at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So we think our collection is in very good company. This is one of the pieces that they told us was quite rare and very beautifully made and in excellent condition for its age, which is probably 19th century. And this slide shows you that the insides of these chests are generally not highly finished, and that's why they're usually covered with paper. Sometimes it's paper with artistic designs, but sometimes it's just newspaper or other kinds of paper. But it would have kept the clothing or other articles that might have been stored there from catching on the splinters of wood. So it was intense and hard work. The Overseas Korean Cultural Heritage Foundation scholars told us that a few of the objects, perhaps 10 out of the more than 200 that we have, were not as old as Dr. Wright had thought, that they were 20th century copies or perhaps even forgeries. But they also told us that about the same number or more were much older and much finer than we had thought. They were 18th century pieces when some of them we had indicated were 20th century. And they indicated that several were probably made for the extended royal family. So we were very happy to have all that information, and we've changed our collection records to indicate all this new information. We think that the work of these scholars really validates Dr. Wright's expertise, as he was trained as a political scientist, not as an art historian or an anthropologist, and he really learned about Korean furniture on his own by looking at many pieces. The way it came to live in Minnesota is an interesting story in itself. In 1967, when Ed Wright went to Seoul to become head of the Korean American Educational Commission, the Korean War had been over for a mere 14 years. During that war, which lasted from 1950 to 1953, millions of civilians died, and fighting effectively destroyed most cities in the north and the south. In the first year of the war alone, Seoul changed hands 4 times, and the disruption of civilian life meant that thousands of refugees roamed the country. Destitute migrants headed for the cities, and all cities, but especially Seoul, experienced a population explosion. In the 1960s, the Republic of Korea, South Korea, was one of the world's poorest countries. It's now one of the wealthiest nations. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or North Korea, remains among the poorest. I think this is quite a graphic slide. This is a little bit earlier than when Ed arrived, but it shows you very well the contrast between the Korea that he went into and Korea as it is now. He was a political scientist who published actively on Korean politics. And during the 11 years he lived in Korea, he began to put together a collection of Korean traditional furniture that probably could not be assembled today. Because of the massive dislocation and poverty of Korean families, there was lots of good furniture for sale. Families were very sadly having to sell their family heirlooms to support the rebuilding of families and businesses. And as I mentioned, although Wright had no formal training in art history, he developed a real love for Korean culture, and along the process, he developed a very good eye. In about 1969, he met Dr. Roger Benjamin, also a political scientist who was interested in Korea, who's with us tonight. And it's because of Roger Benjamin that we have this collection at the University of Minnesota. He was later the provost of the University of Minnesota, my boss, and it was because of him that the collection came to rest at our museum. Ed Wright was not from Minnesota. He was not a graduate of the University of Minnesota. But because of Roger Benjamin and their association, he became convinced that Minnesota would be a good home for his collection. So I have to stop here and offer a short apology for myself. Most of you in this room are far greater experts on Korean culture and arts than I am. I didn't study, like Dr. Wright, I didn't study Korean art in any art history classes. As a matter of fact, when I was taking art history, Korean art wasn't even mentioned in any art history classes, Asian art history classes that I took. I didn't have the advantage of growing up in Korea or in a Korean family. But what I did have is the advantage of looking at and working with this wonderful collection of Korean objects that Dr. Wright left us nearly every day for the past 20-some years. And like Dr. Wright, I learned through constant contact with the objects. I learned to love them and appreciate them and learn something about them. So I hope that at least some of what I have to say tonight might give you a greater appreciation as well. And if you already know everything I have to say, which some of you probably do, I hope that the good new photographs that we've made will delight your eyes and will leave you more impressed by the beauty and elegance of Korean furniture. So I hope that everybody will find something to take away good from this lecture. Elegance and tradition. Those are the words that Dr. Wright used to describe Korean furniture, and it was the subtitle of the book he published first in 1984. Almost every illustration that's in that book is now in our collection. However, it was published before the age of digital photography, so most of the illustrations are in black and white, and the color's not very good. But the text is still quite good. I think it's still the best, most complete text on Korean traditional furniture. Needs some updating and some corrections, but I think it's still the best reference book on traditional Korean furniture published in English. It's my goal to republish this book using substantial parts of Dr. Wright's text, but redesigning it with all new illustrations from our collection, using the new information that was given to us by our Korean visiting scholars, and publishing it with all new color illustrations. To even help to spread the love and appreciation of Korean traditional furniture and culture even further. But that's a project that's a few years down the road. That's my ultimate goal. Like many collectors, Wright was constantly refining his collection, and this process led him to sell pieces of lesser quality when he found similar pieces of higher quality. He left Korea to become a lecturer in Kyoto in 1979, and for the rest of his life, he divided his time between Kyoto, Japan, and San Francisco. He taught in the English department at the university in Kyoto, and in between San Francisco and Kyoto, he spent a lot of time in Korea purchasing more furniture. And during the last years of his life, he operated an active business in San Francisco where he lived for about half the year. He added to his collection, and he supplied pieces to Gumps and several other outlets that he had across the United States. But when I met Ed, it was clear he was always careful to have a very clear separation between what he called his collection and what he would have for sale. And so the finest pieces he always put aside and put in a very separate area of his warehouse. I met Ed in about 1981 when I became director of what was then called the University Gallery. And these are some pictures that I took of Ed's collection in his warehouse in San Francisco in the 1980s. I made several visits to him there, and because the warehouse was not very lighted, it was sort of like a visit to Aladdin's magic cave. And you would go in and your eyes would adjust to the gloom. And then Ed would start to carry pieces out onto the sidewalk so we could see them better, because there really wasn't much way you could see them in the warehouse. So it's sort of like he's opening his magic pack. And as the day went on, more and more pieces would come out till the whole sidewalk in front of the warehouse would be covered with all these pieces of wonderful Korean furniture. And then he began the process of carrying them back in, not always putting them in exactly the same places they'd come from, but somehow he managed to fit everything back in. And you could see there was quite a lot of it in his warehouse. And oftentimes he would open the drawers or look inside chests, and he'd find things that he didn't know were there. And as a matter of fact, when the collection came to us, we were still finding things inside some of these pieces. Sometimes we would find typescripts of some of his manuscripts for scholarly papers that would be inside. Sometimes articles of traditional clothing or jewelry pieces that the previous owners had neglected to remove. So you may still be thinking, what does Minnesota have to do with Korea? And why was Ed Wright persuaded to give his collection there? Apart from the fact that his friend Roger Benjamin was a very persuasive person. But actually, the University of Minnesota has a long and continuing history of ties to Korea, particularly with Korean education. In 1954, following the end of the Korean War, the University of Minnesota was one of a few American universities that was entered into a contract with the U.S. Foreign Operations Administration, now the Agency for International Development. And the goal was to strengthen and develop education and research programs, particularly at Seoul National University. In 1962, at the conclusion of this contract, I think there was the University of Minnesota and maybe 3 or 4 other universities in the U.S. that were given these contracts. 226 Koreans had studied in the U.S., and 56 American faculty members had gone to Korea. Most of the Korean students who had come to the U.S. had come to the University of Minnesota, and 2/3 of all the faculty who went to Korea were from the University of Minnesota in fields like agriculture, engineering, medicine, public administration, dentistry, and the arts. Almost all of the University of Minnesota faculty who served in Korea are gone, retired, or gone from the university, but there are still a significant number of Minnesota graduates in positions of influence in Korean business and academia. And as a matter of fact, there's the University of Minnesota Alumni Association in Seoul, and I had the honor of being the speaker about this collection at the first meeting of that Alumni Association back in the 80s. And I discovered when I made that visit to Seoul that one of the earliest international exhibits to be shown at Seoul National University following the end of the Korean War was a 1958 exhibit of the work of faculty members from the University of Minnesota. And Seoul National University art faculty sent an exhibition to our place. And several paintings stayed behind from our faculty members stayed in Seoul, and from their faculty members stayed at our place. And so a number of those paintings are now in the collection of the Weisman Art Museum. And this is a piece that was from that exhibition in 1958. And we've been told by experts who have gasped when they've seen this that this is a very early painting by one of the artists who went on to become one of the most famous modern painters, modern Korean painters. And we've had this in our collection since 1958, since that exhibit. So in addition to the university ties, which Roger Benjamin and Ed Wright knew about, Minnesota also is home to the largest number of Korean adopted children per capita of any state in the United States. The Korean Quarterly, a national publication, is published in Minneapolis. So the Korean community in Minneapolis and in Minnesota generally has deep roots. So maybe Minnesota isn't such an unusual place, after all, for the Wright collection to find a home. Now let's see. Whoops, here we go. All right, so these are some slides I've been showing you of the little Korean corner that we have set up to show only a few pieces from our wonderful collection, but we'll be rotating them through as time goes by. So now I want to turn to the collection itself and talk a little bit about the types of furniture and some stylistic differences. I want to tell you an interesting story about an experience I had with a group of Korean American businessmen who came through our museum before we had the collection out. And so we used to take groups of Korean adopted children and Korean businessmen into our storage areas to show them the collection. So I took this group down to storage and was telling them about the pieces. And our storage area is very high. It's better organized, I think, than Ed's warehouse. But we do have a lot of things stacked on top of each other because we have to make all use of the space. And so there's some pieces up on what we call it was the mezzanine. And one of the gentlemen in the group pointed to this thing on the upper shelf, and he asked me what it was. And I replied that it was a bed. And he said, no, it's not possible. I've never seen anything like that. It has to be something else. So because he was of Korean heritage and I was not, I said, all right, I'm sure you're right. And I accepted his correction, and I went and I looked in our records the next day to see if I'd totally misspoken. And indeed, the piece that he had talked about was indicated as a bed on our records. So I didn't give it any more thought. A few days later, I got a call from this gentleman who had questioned my attribution, and he said to me, well, you know, you're right. It is a bed. It's just that we all came from such poor families, we never had beds. We just rolled our bedding out on the floor. And that gentleman is now on the advisory board of the Weisman Art Museum. We've remained friends all these years. As I'm sure you know, traditional Korean society was floor-based. Unlike China, the chair was not a part of the traditional Korean home. So what developed was a set of really very specialized storage containers. When I take American students on a tour of our Korean galleries, I always remind them that if they stop and think about it, if they take the chair out of Western furniture traditions, a lot of other stuff goes away. A lot of other furniture goes away. You don't have dining room tables, you don't have sofas, you don't have end tables, you don't have desks. And so what you're left with are basically storage containers. And that's what most of traditional Korean furniture is, some very specialized storage containers. So on the up here, here is a hat box, very efficient. It hangs from, so it can hang over the rafters or hang from the ceiling and opens from the bottom. Next is a sewing box made out of paper mache, very lightweight, easy to move from room to room. Next is a woman's cosmetic and mirror box. And then down here, of course, you have a pharmacy or a medicine cabinet in the little display here. And then a box for the storage of traditional robes and a hat. Here are some more medicine cabinets from our collection with the names of the herbal medicines in Chinese on each one of the drawers. I have a suspicion that this one might have been made for use in a doctor's office or a pharmacy because it's really, really large, while the other ones might have been made for home use. This is the very efficient hat box that hangs from the ceiling, made to store this hat with a wide brim and a conical crown. It hangs, and the whole bottom, there's a hinge on the bottom, and the bottom comes out, and you put the hat in, and then it fastens with a pin that goes through it. And here's the box for traditional robes. And when it came to us, it actually had folded robes in it and a hat. And so the robes were folded up, and then the belt was very carefully placed on top of the robes, and then the hat with the side flaps was placed on top of that. And so everything fit absolutely perfectly. Very specialized storage box. The most typical Korean storage box, the most widely used, is the bandaji, and it's certainly the most numerous in our collection. We have 25 of these in our collection. It's basically, as I'm sure you know, a front opening chest, and they're sometimes called blanket chests in the West because they might have been used to store bedding or because folded up bedding might have been placed on top of them during the day. But they were really used to store almost anything, not just blankets. And I think these give you a sense of why I think Korean traditional furniture is so well respected. And it's because it's based on really a wonderful, graceful sense of proportion and respect for materials. All the things that appeal to a contemporary sensibility. As one of my staff members put it, when I was getting ready for this, he said, it's all the things that my Bauhaus-trained modernist architecture professor drilled into my head when I was a student. All of those qualities, respect for materials, proportion, elegance, it's all there, and that's why I think that it's so well respected. The bandaji are incredibly efficient. I have one in my house that I use for storing table linens because unlike Western chests, when I'm, again, talking to students, I always remind them of the humpback chests that their Scandinavian ancestors brought with them, that these are actually much more efficient because they open from the front. And so you don't have to take the things off the top of them to get into them. And they also, because the top comes down, the hinge is usually about halfway down or no more than a third or no less than a third of the way down. It's easy to get in all the way to the bottom. And so as you can see here, you can have things sitting on top of them and still get into them. It's very easy access. Another specialized container that's very common is a head-sized chest, and we have quite a few of those. This one is of Zelkova wood with yellow brass fittings. And this is a is much the same way in the West we would use a bedside table. And it's always one level and usually has lower drawers, so it's easy to get into it. And here's another head-side chest of Zelkova, not quite so exuberant as the last one I showed you, which I'm going to show you some more slides in a minute, with the yellow brass decorative fittings, probably made for a woman's room. You can see, I think you can see pretty well, and certainly you can see in the pieces that you have out there, the bats that are the fittings, the plates behind the handles. Bats, of course, being signifying good fortune. This head-side chest is unusual in that it's decorated with applied paper and stenciled patterns. It was from the just south of Seoul. Perhaps our experts told us it might have been from a poorer household that couldn't afford the highly decorative wood, and so instead covered the surface with paper. I liken it to the kind of the faux marble columns that you see painted in churches, in rural churches in Italy, where they couldn't afford real marble for the columns, and so they painted the faux marble. But this one has really got a lot of charm, I think. And it's interesting that you can see at the top, these aren't real drawers. They're just painted on drawers. And the handles are not real handles. The only way, this is the only place you can get into it. But it's really quite charming and wonderful. And actually, the same types of furniture pieces would be found in households of all classes, but the wealthier families would have had more finely made, more beautiful wood, better craftsmanship. So at the opposite extreme from this last one is a head-side chest that's black, or that's red lacquered wood with black highlights. It was made mid to 19th century, and probably, we were told, for the extended royal family, for which the lacquer finish was reserved. You can see that the chest is very elegant, and the fittings are quite beautiful and decorative with bats and with a chrysanthemum or floral pattern. Another common type of container is a document box or scroll storage box, and also the wedding box, which would have been used to deliver wedding presents, and you have some of these in the exhibit out there. This type of container is a little bit hard to identify because it's kind of a generic shape. A long rectangular, fairly shallow box could have been used for either a wedding box or for a document box. Here's one made of pine, probably made for use in a Buddhist temple, and it's 18th century, so it's one of the earlier pieces. Here's two document storage boxes. The upper one we previously had identified, Ed Wright had identified as being a wedding box. The bottom is one of a pair of 18th century boxes, unusual. They're wicker covered in paper. This was a box that we had previously identified as a stationary tray, but our Korean scholars told us it was probably a smoking box for smoking accessories, that the top would have held a long stemmed pipe, and that other smoking accessories would have been in the drawers. As I'm sure you know, that in a lot of these pieces, the stands are not original. It would have been very easy for the stand to have gotten separated from the piece. And so in many cases, the stand was not original to the piece. And so in a lot of them, you see the stand is not nearly as graceful or as beautifully made as the rest of the piece. And the same, of course, is true for the ones that have locks. The locks were interchangeable and would not necessarily have stayed with the original piece. Another specialized furniture type would have been the chest made for storing coins, the household treasury. The coins were brass or copper, took up a lot of space because by themselves, individually, they didn't have much value. They were round with holes in the center so they could be strung together, and you read about strings of cash. Individually, they didn't have very much worth. These chests usually are pine, although not always. Sometimes are Zelkova wood. They usually had iron fittings, and one of the ways that you can identify them is that they usually have a lot more of these fittings around the edges to give them strength. I think it was probably as much to hold the weight of the coins as it was to keep somebody from breaking into the boxes. This one, I think you can see, it doesn't have any hinges on the top up here. There's no hinges, but it's the whole lid lifts off, so it'd be, again, easy to get into the box. But if there's a lock through here, you can't get the top off. Now, I don't know. These holes are about the size that a coin might have been, so I don't know. It's possible that they could have, been intended that you could put things in without having to unlock it. But then, if you wanted to take things out, you had to unlock it. This is a 19th century piece. And this, I just thought was an interesting illustration that I found on the internet showing you the strings of cash and the coins that would have been stored in these kinds of boxes and why they had to be so strong. Here's another coin chest. This one is Zelkova. This one is from North Korea, according to our recent scholars. Here's another one of Zelkova with a much smaller opening. You can see the opening is pretty small. Most of the coin chests that have much larger openings on the top, but it has still this lot of reinforcement around the edges. This is another piece that we had previously identified as a coin chest, but our recent scholars said it was probably not, that it was 19th century, but that it probably was not a coin chest because coin chests rarely had such decorative ornamental fittings. They are iron, and it does have the reinforcement around the edges, but it's not. They said that it would be unusual for a coin chest to have this much of a decoration in the iron fittings. Now, this was another big surprise for us. According to our scholarly visits, we had always identified this as a coin chest. It has those characteristics, although the fittings, again, are a little bit more decorative. But they said it was used to store dried seafood. And they believe they could even still smell the dry seafood in the wood of the chest. I had a little trouble discerning the smell myself, but I take their word for it. This piece is also from Northern Korea. And it's probably, they said, early 19th century, so much older than we thought it was. This is a baby coin chest made of pine with iron fittings. And this is one of those pieces for which we received a rather less pleasant surprise. They told us it was probably made in the 1950s, not in the 19th century, and probably made as to sell. Somebody made it based on an older design. Drawers, when they exist in Korean furniture, are usually, but not always, hidden behind doors. At the top, you can see the beautiful headside chest with persimmon panels here. And then you can see it's a little bit hard to see, but you get right back in here. There's a whole series of drawers there. And at the bottom is what's called a safe, made of Zelkova wood. And when it's closed, you have no idea that it's there. Again, a little hard to see. Maybe you can see it better than I can, but there's a whole series of drawers, excuse me, on the inside. Here's another safe, mid-19th century, from near Seoul with very fine metalwork, probably made for a high-ranking person. But again, we learned that the outer piece is very fine and fairly early, but that the drawers are probably all new. And this is not unusual in Korean furniture. That things that could fall out and come away, like a stand or a drawer, might have to be replaced and might not be original to the piece. Quite a number of the pieces we have have special hidden compartments like this one. Not really hidden compartments, but they have an interesting way of getting into them, because it's not really obvious when you look at it at first glance how you get into it. But the panels actually lift out, and one panel lifts out, and it's usually this one, and then the other panels have to slide to that spot before they lift out. You can't lift them out, and you have to know which one to lift out first. And the same way with putting them back. They have to be put back in exactly the right order. This one is late 19th century, and Zelkova. So the lift-up position, here's another one that's a part of one of a pair. The lift-out position is this panel again. That panel, it just lifts out, and then each of the other ones slides over to that slot, and then they can be lifted out. This is beautiful, a beautiful one made out of persimmon. Here's a 4-level chest of paulownia and pine. Very often the front panels would be made out of a more decorative material, more decorative wood like Zelkova or persimmon or paulownia, and then the frame would be made out of pine or a denser wood. And below is a book storage chest with persimmon, Zelkova, and pine. And this one has actually drawers that you can see that aren't hidden. But the bottom panels, again, are the lift-out kind of panels. Korean craftsmen really respected the wood and the wholeness of the piece. The applied decoration is usually confined to metal hinges and fasteners. And more than any other furniture of the East, Korean furniture depended on the beauty of the natural materials. Even the most ornate pieces usually depended on a skillful use of wood rather than a painted or inlaid decoration. Some, as you've seen, are lacquered, but they generally don't have inlaid mother of pearl. A few pieces do, but that's not common. It's usually knowing how to use the wonderful grains of the wood. And this is one of my favorite pieces in our collection. It's made out of persimmon wood on the front panels, pear wood frame, paulownia sides, and white brass fittings. And you can see on this piece, as on the others, that generally they were made to be viewed only from the front. So they would have been made to be placed against a wall with something else beside them, because the sides are not highly finished and the back is not highly finished at all. So it was definitely made to be placed against a wall. This is actually made in 2 pieces. You can see where the seam is right there. But on many of them, when they're put together, it's really, unless you look very closely, it's hard to tell where they come together. But again, this makes them very very efficient. It's much easier to move if it's in 2 pieces, to move it from room to room, than if it were a piece of furniture that was this size and it was all one piece. It would be very awkward to move. I love to put this piece next to an early 20th century, or next to this mural. That piece is early 20th century, and I love to put it next to this mural in our collection, mural fragment by Robert Motherwell from 1950, because I think they have the same spirit, the same energy, the same, and I'll show you a slide where they're side by side so you can see what I mean. Don't you think they just sing when they're next to each other? And so I always, whenever I can, I have them in the galleries so that you can look from one to the other. Sometimes they're side by side, but not always. And then another really wonderful comparison is this piece with these 1930s paintings by an artist named Charles Biederman. And again, it's the same energy. And also, this piece, the piece of Korean furniture, has a slight Art Deco look about it, which it isn't, of course. It's something that I bring to it that the person who made it never intended. But it's kind of interesting to make these comparisons. And this one you saw before, this one is made of dragon wood. And as I mentioned, the skillful use of the wood grain is one of the most appealing features of traditional Korean furniture. And the craftsmen who made these pieces were absolute masters at bringing out the best in the wood. Zelkova wood is the same botanical family as elm, and it's sometimes called dragon wood in Korea because of the swirls, the distinctive swirls of the grain, giving the appearance of dragons, which, as I'm sure you know, in the east are water creatures associated with clouds and with rain. And while in the west, dragons are enemies and things that are supposed to be killed and wiped off the earth. In Korea and in the east, they're associated with positive features, with clouds. And so you can see the swirls, the wonderful swirls here of the dragonwood. This one is also 19th century. This is a piece that we had identified as 19th century, but the scholars who came to visit us placed it at least 100 years earlier and indicated that it was of royal origin. And it's also, you can see the Zelkova patterns, and you can see again the bats in the handles. This piece uses Zelkova and persimmon panels has drawers or doors at the bottom to hide the medicine drawers. It's a very interesting piece, and we thought it was fairly early, but unfortunately, this is one that our scholars told us was probably actually a forgery, not a copy, but a forgery. You know, there's a thin line between a forgery and a copy. So, but it's still, I think, quite beautiful and unusual. We don't have anything else like this in our collection with the medicine panels at the bottom. Here's a beautiful piece, undoubtedly for a woman's room. You can see the butterflies in the hinges, the butterflies, and the bats up in the drawer pulls, probably early 20th century. The split Zelkova slabs and the split persimmon slabs were often used to provide mirror image patterns on the fronts of Korean chests. And this is persimmon. And in a lot of them, when they use the persimmon, it evokes a style of landscape painting, a Chinese style landscape painting, with the wood grain forming those stylized mountain peaks, mountains being sacred places as being close to the immortals. And so these kinds of mountains have a very special place in Chinese and in Korean art. And here's one of the paintings from Korea from our exchange exhibition with Seoul National University in the 50s, and you can see how the persimmon panels on this piece really make a wonderful landscape. One of the special things about our collection is that it contains quite a number of pieces from what is now North Korea. Because of the time it was collected, there was a lot of North Korean material available because families had fled, bringing what they could, and now were required to sell, to start new businesses or to keep their families going. And the North Korean material is identifiable in many cases because it's much more covered with applied decoration than the pieces from the South. Perhaps because of the climate, because trees that have a more decorative pattern in the wood grain don't grow so easily in the North. The artists had to rely more on applied decoration, metal decoration, because the wood in itself was not so decorative. So the North Korean pieces are often covered with this distinctive metalwork, lots more metalwork. Sometimes more of the North Korean pieces are painted with paper, and sometimes even faux leather or paper that's painted to imitate wood is used. But we have quite a number of North Korean pieces, and I'm going to show you a few here. You can see the beautiful fittings. In this case, the fittings are rather plain, and only the handle, which is decorative, it's not used because it opens here, and these are the handles that would be used to pull it open. So that's purely a decorative handle here, and it's engraved. Here's one also from North Korea. And it's got this filigree type of iron metal work. And the central motif here is the south gate of the city, which was the main gate of the city, and so the most important gate. And so you'll see that on a lot of Korean furniture in the decorative metalwork. Actually, I've looked at a lot of pictures of gates of Korean cities, and I can't tell that in appearance the south gate is much different from other gates, but it was the most important gate, and so this is always called the south gate motif. Here's another one from the west, from North Korea, with a lot more decorative metalwork. And here's a beautiful one with all sorts of auspicious signs and symbols etched into the metalwork. And you have a really very similar piece to this in the collection in the other room. And I think, yeah, here's another one with beautiful, lots of engraving on the metalwork, white brass fittings. And yeah, I've got a little bit of a close-up. So you can see the bats here, and you can see how all of this metalwork is engraved. And there's an even... There are also some regional styles, and one distinctive style of bandaji comes from Jeju Island off the south tip, and this is a Jeju Island piece. They generally have this swallowtail design on the front, and oftentimes Buddhist swastika and chrysanthemums. And so this is a typical example, probably from the 18th century. It has it all, but the Jeju Island pieces are really pretty recognizable. And I want to talk a little bit about joinery and woodworking. This is a wonderful piece from our collection. It's one of the most typical pieces that a Korean carpenter would have used, and it's an incline holder. You would have pulled the line out of this animal-shaped snout and across a cloth that would have been impregnated with black ink, and then you would have snapped it to make a straight line on the furniture in the same way that Western carpenters use a chalk line to snap it so they would know where to cut. So this apparently was the most favorite tool of the really specialized craftsmen, and everyone would have his own very special chalk line or ink line. And just a few close-ups. This one to show you how the metalwork was applied with the fine metalwork was applied with these brads. This is one of the inset molding bars. The finishes on Korean furniture were very often colored clay softened with water and then rubbed very thinly into the wood to make an undercoat, and then it would be finished with oil on the top. Sometimes there's no undercoat. Sometimes it's just oiled, and sometimes animal blood might have been used to darken the wood, but it's always put on very thinly, whether it's clay or animal blood, so as not to obscure the grain of the wood. And I've read that sometimes for smaller pieces, the whole piece would be smoked or heated, so that would bring out the resin out of the wood, and then as the resin came to the surface, the craftsman would use a soft cloth to rub the resin and to seal the surface in that way. Here's some close-ups of the really beautiful dovetail or finger joints. More joints, and here's joints that are mortise and tenon that would been used. You can see the top piece, how the top piece is attached. The side legs are attached to the top piece. So the traditional Korean household would have been arranged according to Confucian standards. And this is another stylistic distinction, is whether a piece of furniture was made for a man's room or a woman's room. The women's quarters were generally in the inner parts of the compound, whereas the men's were more outward-looking. And in a large, wealthy family, there would be lots of servants and other quarters. And these figures are from Dr. Wright's book. And this would be typical arrangement of furniture in a man's room and the typical arrangement of furniture in a woman's room. And so you can see that the pieces are pretty much the same. It's just that the way they were made. The women's would have been more brightly embroidered. The screens would have been brightly embroidered with flowers and birds, whereas in the man's room they would have had Chinese characters and symbols of Confucian virtues. And the furniture was much more somber. Here's a comparison of a box made for a woman's room and a box made for a man's room. And I love here, I think they're wonderful. You can see this is the heavenly peach on this little pull, and here's a wonderful little bat here. I think the women's furniture is wonderful, much more wonderful. I'd love to have this box on my dresser table. There's another women's cosmetic and incidentals mirror box, and you can see how the wood grain is used to be much more decorative than a similar box would have been for a man's room. This is a woman's comb and incidental box. Really interesting feature of these is that long tongue that you see coming down here. When you open the box and put the tongue down, it forms a stand. And so it holds up the lid so it doesn't plunk in the back and mar the finish of the box. And so the tongue is always just the right length so that it supports the lid when you open the box. This one doesn't have a mirror, but another wonderful bat with little flowers there. And here's one of the engraved butterflies on one of the pieces. Another woman's box, again, with the long tongue that would hold it up so the lacquer wouldn't get chipped by the lid flopping against it, with a floral motif here. Another one, a woman's box. This is actually brighter in reality, and I'm sure it was much brighter when it was originally made. This is printed paper. The wood's been covered with printed paper. And it's one of a pair that we have. And this is a head-side chest made for a woman's room. I think I showed you this one earlier. And another one, I showed you this one earlier, which is beautifully lacquered, and you can see all the butterflies that are, and very decorative metalwork that's applied. And again, that this is two pieces, although it fits together, so it really looks as if it were one. This is another two-level chest with exuberant landscape mountain paintings on it. A document box for a woman's room. And here's a document box for a man's room. And here are other furniture pieces that are made for a man's room. The wardrobe chest, which I think is this, was made of paulownia, and paulownia apparently was considered to be insect repellent. So a lot of things that were intended to be used for storing clothing were made of paulownia. It's kind of like a cedar chest in the Western tradition. Here's another chest, a book storage chest for a man's room. You can see that it's very austere. And the kitchen usually would have been located very close to the women's quarters, and we do have a few pieces of wonderful kitchen furniture in our collection. The Wright collection includes a number of these, a rice washing bowl, other bowls, a rice cake press, altar stands, and other miscellaneous household items. And, of course, quite a lot of tray tables that have been used for serving or eating or sometimes writing. More altar stands. We have quite a number of these. And then we have this, what I think is really a drop-dead gorgeous kitchen cabinet. It's, again, this one is 3 levels, so it would have been easy to move around and quite beautiful and easy to get into each of the 3 levels. And here's a kitchen cabinet, a pine kitchen cabinet with just a shelf at the bottom for storing cooking equipment. This is really a very strange piece. This is a banjaji that our scholars told us was made probably by an amateur cabinet maker who really didn't have the craft down. You can see it's got this funny little drawer at the bottom. You have to take that drawer completely out. It's got a shelf a horizontal shelf on the inside of it. So you have to take this drawer at the bottom completely out in order to get into the bottom compartment. And then the top compartment you can get into it folds down. And then we have these really beautiful rice or bean storage chests with Zelkova front panels. And these also aren't hinged. The top comes completely off, removes completely off. So it would make it really easy, again, to scoop in if you're trying to get the grains out of them. And there's really no reason that these needed to have. They're really totally. They're for the kitchen. They're not. They're not where anybody's going to see them. But they still had these wonderfully decorative Zelkova panels in the front. So we realized that these grain storage chests would never have been arranged in this way in a Korean household. We think they make a wonderfully sculptural entrance to our little Korean furniture gallery, sort of the south gate. It's our south gate to our Korean gallery. And so I'd like you all to come to the Land of the Midnight Sun to see this wonderful collection of Korean furniture. And thank you for inviting me. I can try to answer a couple of questions if you have any, but don't ask me anything too hard. Yeah.
Well, the collection is famous. We don't know much about Ed Wright personally, what motivated him to accumulate such a great collection. And he seemed to have died pretty young. Was he ill at the time?
Yeah, he was. He died young, and we received the collection much sooner than we thought we were going to. Roger, would you be willing to talk a little bit about Ed? Because you were the one who really knew him and what motivated him to start this collection. I knew him, but not for as long as you did.
Sure. He was. Okay. Yes, sure. He was born in Atlanta, PhD from Duke, and he specialized in the foreign policy of Indochina and studied at Strasbourg for a couple of years, and then I want to say 62 or 3 do field work. He went to Saigon and I don't think he really enjoyed his time there. It was beginning to become more difficult, but actually he met quite a few Koreans there, and one thing led to another, and he was offered the job of being the director of the Fulbright program at Korea. And I think this collection, you have to view the collection in the context of Ed's role in Korean U.S. relations, and he's yet to be given his proper due through the full leadership of the Fulbright program. And as Lyndel just said, the Koreans' per capita income was the Korea had been destroyed in the war, but Ed from '66 on, for about 15 years, identified a cadre of the most talented young Koreans and sponsored them to come to the States and Europe. Kyunghwa Chung. I mean, you're talking about some of today's finest Korean artists and scholars. He sponsored a whole generation of political scientists, social scientists, and others that became leaders. It was a tough time when I was there in the early 70s. It was a very tough dictatorship and problematic in many ways, but I think he played a very, very major role in that respect. This really was his love right from the beginning. He, as Lyndel says, had an eye. I don't think he ever had an intention to collect this for himself at all. He was there in the aftermath of the devastation, and there was really no interest. It's not that the Koreans, of course, didn't have an interest in their own patrimony, but they didn't have the wherewithal to, in fact, do anything about it. So he did amass this collection. When he brought it and was thinking about bringing it to the United States, he made sure to get the approval of the Korean government. There was you're not talking about anything here that was done in an underhanded way, as frankly one sees in our experience with other collections. So that's a little bit about Ed. Reticent. I don't know what he would do with the Facebook, Twitter generation that we have now, but I did remember a vignette that I told Lyndel. He, based on his Strasbourg experience, fell in love, spoke good French, fell in love with French culture and wine and cheese. And then he goes to Asia, where you don't have any wine and cheese. And so he visits us. We have a second home in Southwest France, and we pick him up at the airport. We're going to the Loire somewhere, and he says, Roger, hey, could you just take me to a little supermarché? So he goes in, and he sees a normal distribution of the couple hundred cheeses there, and all of the wine, and he just grabs them all in a cart. And when we get to our little hotel, he starts taking them out. And this is 20 years after he'd been able to actually taste anything except the PX cheese, Philadelphia cheese, I might add. I don't want to insult anybody here, but it's not quite the same. And he was rolling around on the ground, really, just laughing hysterically. But a wonderful man, and he's left behind a lot of good memories. And the young, most of the Korean colleagues that he and I worked with are retired, but that there is a substantial group that are actually very important in Korea now, and it was that generation that led to what we now have as the 10th economy.
Do you mind me asking how old he was when he passed?
It was AIDS, and he was an early victim. It's very sad. This is 88, wasn't it?
88, I think that's right.
And that's
In his 40s?
he was 50 or 51 or 2.
Yeah.
And just very sadly living in Kyoto and San Francisco, and of course we didn't have any ways to cope with the terrible disease at that time, and so he and I'd had a long-term friendship, and he calls me up one day and said, "Roger, you please come and help sort some of these things out." And it wasn't just me. I think he knew perfectly well about the history of the relationship between the university and the Twin Cities being the home of a large expat Korean population. He knew that it would be a good home and be for his collection. And that because of the other ties that were strong between the two countries. So it has worked out, and I want to salute Lyndel, because I was just back. I hadn't been back in some years. I live in New York now, but I was at Minnesota a long time. And it anchors, this collection is superbly displayed in the museum, in a museum which Lyndel's responsible for, and it's not a typical university museum at all.
No. As our president said when we opened, whose name was Hasselmo from Sweden, he said, it's not a very Lutheran building.
It's a great museum. I've been there.
Most university museums are much more Lutheran in style. Anybody else? Thank you, Roger. Thank you. Yeah. I asked Roger if he had some more pictures of Ed, because we're trying to put together a little archive now that we have the collection out. Yeah.
There seemed to be an unusually large number of coin boxes. Does this suggest a rather rudimentary banking system in the 18th and 19th century?
I think it probably does.
What about pawn shops?
I don't know.
What each of those were?
I don't know. I know that each household, had their own bank that they kept their cash in, and so I think there was probably a pretty rudimentary system, and that banks. banks, as we know them today, are fairly recent. Yeah, and wouldn't have existed in the 18th or 19th century at all in Korea. Probably not until after the Korean War, actually, in Korea. Probably not until the second half of the 20th century in Korea. So yeah, you were kind of responsible for your own cash. So I know that they were much thicker wood. They're made out of much thicker wood, and they have all that iron reinforcing. But again, the coins were really heavy, and so it was as much to keep them in as to keep thieves out. Yeah.
We're talking about the symbol of bat on the chest. Recently I purchased the one chest from the American who claims that is Japanese Dansu.
No, I don't think so.
The bat symbol I thought was Korean.
Well, it's also Chinese, and I asked someone, why is the bat a symbol of happiness, good fortune? Because it doesn't. I mean, here we certainly don't associate bats that fly out in the night as symbols of good fortune. And I was told that it had to do with the Chinese characters for bat and for happiness.
It's a harmony.
Pronunciation.
It's
Yes.
Balk also means happiness. It's a harmony.
Yeah. That's what I had understood. So that's where I thought it came from.
So I made the right choice then.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I had the microphone.
Oh, sorry.
There was another museum of contemporary Korean art. I'm sorry, another exhibition of contemporary Korean art in 1958.
Yes.
It claims to be the first exhibition of contemporary Korean art in America at the Little House Gallery in 1958. So now you say you had this exhibition.
I don't know which was first.
Well, what month was you?
I'll have to check that out and let you know. I'll get back to you on that.
Who curated it?
I don't know.
That would be interesting if you could make that claim, because there's other.
Yeah. Well, what I've always thought, what I've been talking about for years now, is that we should do a repeat of that exhibition. We should have faculty from the University of Minnesota go to show at the wonderful new Seoul, or not new any longer, Seoul National University Gallery, and bring their faculty to show at Minnesota. But we haven't quite got that together yet. But I'll check it out. No, there's a checklist. I mean, but there's no catalog. There's a checklist, but there's no catalog. But I'm sure there is. I just haven't looked at it. Yeah, I will though, and I've got your card. And I'll let you know. No, it's one more claim. I like to go around making claims, and I'm always glad when people substantiate them. So, yeah, but I'll see when I was. Oh, you'll have to tell me what month that one was. Okay, so we'll exchange. Yeah. Did you have a question? Anybody else? Thank you very much for your attention. I really appreciate it. It's great fun.
Thank you.